The last thing Marcus Whitfield remembered from his first life was the sound of his own ribs cracking as he threw himself in front of a bullet meant for his comrade, and the first thing he remembered from his second life was waking up in that exact same moment, staring at the barrel of a rifle, with just enough time to make a different choice. Before we go any further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the idea that all of us deserve a second chance at doing the right thing, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you can stay close to our family and our community as we tell more stories like this one. Marcus had lived his entire first life as a man who put others before himself, and it had cost him everything. He had been a quiet, unremarkable accountant in a mid-sized town before a strange twist of fate led him into military service later than most, driven by a guilt he never fully explained to anyone, not even to himself. In that first life, he had a comrade named Grayson Hale, a broad-shouldered, easy-laughing young man from a coastal town who talked more about his fiancée, Celeste Faraday, than he did about anything else in the world. Grayson would describe her laugh like it was a physical thing he could hold in his hands, would talk about the little apartment they were saving up for, about the garden she wanted with tomatoes and sunflowers, about the wedding they kept postponing because there was never enough money and never enough time. Marcus had never met Celeste in that first life, but he felt like he knew her, the way you know a character in a story someone tells you again and again around a campfire. On the day Marcus died the first time, they had been pinned down during a routine patrol that went wrong, the kind of ambush that lives in the small print of history and never makes the news. Grayson had frozen, just for a second, the way any human being might freeze when the world turns to gunfire and dust, and Marcus, without thinking, without calculating, had shoved him aside and taken the shot meant for his heart. He remembered the impact more than the pain, a punch of heat and pressure that emptied his lungs of air and his mind of thought. He remembered Grayson screaming his name. He remembered the sky, impossibly blue, indifferent to the fact that a man was dying beneath it. And then he remembered nothing, until he opened his eyes and found himself back in that same dust, that same blinding sun, that same rifle pointed toward Grayson's chest, and a single, impossible thought searing through his mind: I have been given this moment again. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, memories of an entire life he hadn't lived yet flickered through him like a film reel running backward: the funeral no one important attended, the folded flag handed to a mother who wept alone, the quiet, hollow years that followed for Grayson, years Marcus had never witnessed in life but somehow now carried within him as though they were his own scars. He saw Grayson marry Celeste in a small courthouse, saw the light go out of his eyes bit by bit over the years that followed, not from any single tragedy but from the slow erosion of unspoken guilt, the kind that eats a man from the inside for surviving when someone else did not. He saw Celeste change too, saw the warmth drain out of their marriage as Grayson buried himself in work and silence, saw her eyes wander toward someone else's kindness because her husband had forgotten how to offer his own. It was as if fate itself had handed Marcus a preview of a future built entirely on his own death, and in the same instant, had given him the terrifying freedom to refuse it. So this time, when the ambush began and the world dissolved into gunfire and screaming and the impossible tightness of fear in his throat, Marcus did not throw himself toward the bullet. He grabbed Grayson by the collar and hauled him down behind a crumbling stone wall instead, both of them landing hard in the dirt, breath knocked from their lungs, hearts hammering like war drums. The bullet that would have taken his life buried itself in the wall inches above their heads, spraying chips of stone across their backs. Grayson turned to him, eyes wide with a confusion that would take root and grow for years to come, and asked him, voice cracking, why he hadn't done what he always did, why he hadn't been the one to jump first, to take the hit, to be the hero. Marcus did not have an answer he could give out loud. The truth, that he had lived this exact moment before and died from it, that he had seen the wreckage that heroism leaves behind for those who survive it, was not something any sane person would believe, and so he simply said that he wanted them both to make it home, and left it at that. They survived that day, the two of them, dust-covered and trembling and alive, and in the weeks that followed, something shifted in the quiet architecture of their friendship. Marcus began to see Grayson not as a story he'd heard secondhand but as a real, breathing person with real fears, someone who laughed too loud when he was nervous and went quiet when he missed home, someone who kept a photograph of Celeste folded into a small leather notebook, its corners soft from years of handling. Marcus found himself studying that photograph one evening when Grayson showed it to him unprompted, a woman with warm brown eyes and a smile that seemed to hold more patience than joy, and something in his chest tightened with a recognition he couldn't explain, the strange vertigo of meeting, for the first time, someone he had already grieved for in another life he was no longer living. Their unit finished its deployment without further incident, at least nothing that matched the horror of that single afternoon, and when they returned home, Grayson invited Marcus to the small ceremony where he and Celeste would finally be married, no longer willing to wait for money or perfect timing after everything they had been through. Marcus almost declined. Some instinct told him that meeting her, becoming entangled in their lives beyond the battlefield, was dangerous territory, ground that could shift beneath him in ways he couldn't predict. But Grayson insisted, said that Marcus was the reason he was alive to be standing at that altar at all, said that family isn't only blood, sometimes it's the man who chooses you when the world tries to take you away, and Marcus, moved more than he wanted to admit, agreed to come. Celeste Faraday, in person, was both exactly and nothing like the woman Marcus had imagined from Grayson's stories. She had the warm brown eyes, yes, and a laugh that did indeed seem to fill a room the way Grayson always described, but there was also a tiredness in her that Grayson's stories had never mentioned, a weariness around the edges of her smile that spoke of years spent waiting for a man who was always somewhere else, even when he was standing right beside her. Marcus noticed it immediately, the way you notice a hairline crack in a wall you've been told is perfectly solid. At the small reception afterward, held in the backyard of Grayson's aunt's house with paper lanterns and mismatched folding chairs, Celeste thanked Marcus quietly for bringing her husband home safely, and there was something in the way she said it, gratitude tangled with an exhaustion she didn't try very hard to hide, that told him she had already spent years preparing herself for the version of this story where he did not come home at all. In the months that followed, Marcus struggled to build a life outside the military, the way many men do when the structure that once organized every hour of their day simply disappears. He took a job at a hardware store in the same town where Grayson and Celeste had settled, not entirely by accident, though he told himself it was simply convenient. He watched, from the careful distance of friendship, as the marriage he had glimpsed in that terrible vision of an unlived future began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to take the same shape anyway. Grayson could not leave the war behind the way his body had, his mind stayed tangled in it, in nightmares he refused to discuss, in a guilt he could never quite name because, in this timeline, no one had died for him to feel guilty about, and yet the guilt came anyway, phantom weight without a phantom limb to explain it, guilt that simply is the price some men pay for having survived at all. He grew distant. He worked long hours at a job he didn't love, came home late, spoke less, and Celeste, who had spent years being patient with a fiancé at war, found herself now being patient with a husband who had returned but never fully come home. Marcus watched this unfold with a growing, uncomfortable sense of helplessness, because he understood something neither Grayson nor Celeste could possibly know, that this pain, this slow unraveling, was not caused by the bullet he had dodged but by something deeper in Grayson himself, something that no single act of heroism or its absence could fix. He began spending more time at their house, at first simply as a friend checking in, bringing over tools to fix a leaking faucet or a squeaking door, staying for dinner because Celeste, lonely in the particular way of someone married to an absent man, seemed to genuinely want the company. He told himself repeatedly that his presence there was only about loyalty to Grayson, about being the kind of friend who shows up. But somewhere in the quiet, ordinary evenings, Celeste laughing at something small he said while washing dishes, the two of them sitting on the porch steps while Grayson worked another late shift, the particular comfort of being truly listened to after years of feeling invisible, something began to grow in Marcus that he recognized, with a kind of dread, as more than friendship. He fought it, at first, with the stubbornness of a man who believes he can out-discipline his own heart. He told himself that whatever he felt was simply an echo of the strange bond fate had woven between the three of them, a closeness born of a death he alone remembered and a life he alone had chosen to prevent. He told himself that Celeste's warmth toward him was only gratitude, nothing more, the kind of gratitude a woman feels toward the man who kept her husband alive. He buried himself in work at the hardware store, took on extra shifts, tried to create distance where none seemed to want to exist. But guilt has a way of following a man even when he tries to outrun it with good intentions, and Marcus carried a particular, private guilt that no one else could see, the knowledge that he had changed fate itself to save his friend's life, and that the very life he had saved was now slowly falling apart in front of him, and that he, of all people, was the one falling for the woman his friend was failing to hold on to. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, bright and warm, the kind of day that seems too gentle to hold any lasting consequence. Grayson had missed Celeste's birthday dinner entirely, not out of malice but out of the particular numbness that had settled over him, a numbness so complete that he genuinely forgot, called late that night from a bar with his co-workers, his voice thick with an apology that arrived too late to mean anything. Marcus found Celeste the next day sitting alone on the porch steps, a cold cup of tea forgotten beside her, staring out at nothing in particular with the specific stillness of someone who has run out of tears for the moment but expects more later. He sat down beside her without asking permission, the way old friends do, and for a long while neither of them spoke. When she finally did speak, her voice was quiet and stripped of any performance, the voice of someone too tired to pretend anymore. She told him she didn't know the man she'd married anymore, that she loved the boy who used to write her letters full of hope and tomato gardens, but that the man who'd come home from war seemed to be living in a country she couldn't visit, one made entirely of silence and distance. She told him she felt guilty for even feeling this way, because he had survived, because so many other women had received folded flags instead of tired husbands, and who was she to complain about a man who came home breathing? Marcus listened, and something in him ached with a recognition so deep it frightened him, because in the life he remembered, the one he had erased, Grayson had died and Celeste had grieved a hero, and now Grayson lived and Celeste grieved a marriage anyway, and Marcus understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that there had never been a version of this story where everyone simply got to be happy. Loss finds its way into a life regardless of the shape it takes. He told her, that afternoon, more truth than he intended to. Not the truth about the bullet, not the truth about the life he remembered that had never technically happened, because some truths are too heavy to hand to another person without warning. But he told her that Grayson loved her still, that the distance in him wasn't about her at all, that some men carry battles home in their chests long after the shooting stops and don't know how to put the weight down without help. He told her that giving up on him now, when he needed her most, even if he was terrible at showing he needed her, would be its own kind of tragedy, one that neither of them could take back. And even as he said these words, urging her toward patience with her husband, some quiet and shameful part of him wondered whether he was speaking for Grayson's sake, or protecting himself from a truth about his own heart that he wasn't ready to face. Celeste looked at him for a long moment after he finished speaking, and something passed across her face that he couldn't quite name, surprise, maybe, or a kind of aching gratitude, or something more complicated that neither of them dared to give a name to yet. She told him that he was a good friend, better than most people got in this life, and thanked him for reminding her why she'd fallen in love with Grayson in the first place. But even as she said it, Marcus felt the words settle strangely in his chest, because he understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having already lived and died once, that a good friend does not sit on a porch step wishing he were something more to another man's wife. He made a decision that day, one that would define the shape of everything that followed. He decided to disappear, quietly and without drama, from the daily orbit of their lives. He took a transfer to a hardware store 2 towns over, told Grayson it was for better pay, which was true enough to not feel like a lie, and slowly began to let the threads of easy friendship fray at the edges, not through any cruelty but through the simple mechanics of distance and time. He told himself this was the noble choice, the choice a good man makes when he loves his friend more than he trusts his own heart. For nearly a year, he lived quietly on the edges of their story, hearing updates only second-hand, through mutual friends, through the occasional strained phone call from Grayson that grew shorter and less frequent as the months wore on. But fate, it seemed, was not finished testing him. The updates that filtered through to him painted a picture darker than he had hoped. Grayson's drinking had increased, his temper had grown short, and though he never once raised a hand to Celeste, Marcus would have intervened immediately if he had. he had grown cruel in the quieter ways that leave no visible bruises, cutting remarks, cold silences that stretched for days, an absence of tenderness that slowly starved a marriage of everything that had once made it worth keeping. And then, on a gray morning nearly 14 months after that porch conversation, Marcus received a call from Grayson himself, his voice slurred and broken in a way Marcus had never heard from him, not even in the worst hours of combat. Celeste had left. She had packed a single suitcase, left a note on the kitchen table, and moved in with her sister 2 states away, and Grayson, in the wreckage of that morning, called the one person he still trusted enough to call. Marcus drove through the night to reach him, the single necessary exception to the daytime rule of this story, a dark, silent drive under a sky heavy with stars, because some grief simply cannot wait for morning, and found Grayson sitting alone in a house that had once been full of paper lanterns and hope, surrounded by empty bottles and the particular wreckage of a man who has finally run out of ways to pretend he's fine. Marcus stayed with him through that night and the days that followed, not offering easy comfort or hollow promises, but simply presence, the same quiet, stubborn presence that had once made him throw himself in front of a bullet without thinking twice. He drove Grayson to a counselor 2 weeks later, sat in the parking lot for the full hour of that first appointment because Grayson asked him to, said he wasn't sure he could walk out of that building without knowing someone was still there waiting. He listened to Grayson cry, for the first time since Marcus had known him, actually cry, not the controlled grief of a funeral but the messy, ugly grief of a man confronting the parts of himself he'd spent years running from. It was in those difficult weeks that the truth Marcus had buried finally came to the surface, not through some dramatic confession but through the slow, grinding honesty that grief tends to demand. Grayson, sober for the first time in longer than he could admit, asked him one afternoon, with the directness of a man who has nothing left to lose, whether Marcus had ever had feelings for Celeste. Marcus considered lying. He considered it seriously, weighed the kindness of a comfortable falsehood against the risk of a painful truth, and in the end chose the truth, because he had already died once for this man and he was not going to insult that sacrifice with a lie now. He told Grayson everything, not about the bullet, not about the life he remembered that had never technically happened, that secret he still could not find words for, but about the feelings that had grown in him during those porch evenings, about the guilt that had driven him away, about the year of distance he had built specifically to protect the very marriage that had crumbled anyway despite his sacrifice. He expected anger. He expected, perhaps, the end of the only real friendship he had left in the world. Instead, Grayson sat in silence for a long time, staring at his own hands, and then said something that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life, that he had known, in some quiet corner of himself, for a long time, not because Marcus or Celeste had ever done anything wrong, but because he had watched Marcus love her the way he himself had forgotten how to, and that watching it had been its own strange, backward mirror, showing him everything he'd let slip away through his own numbness and neglect. He said he didn't blame Marcus for feeling what he felt, because feelings arrive uninvited and cannot always be reasoned with. What mattered was what a man did with them, and Marcus had done the harder, better thing by leaving rather than staying and complicating an already fragile marriage. He said, with a rawness that surprised them both, that if there was ever a future where Celeste and Marcus found their way to each other, he would rather know that the two people he loved most had found happiness than know that everyone stayed miserable and lonely out of some misplaced sense of guilt. It took time after that, real time, the unglamorous kind that doesn't fit neatly into a single dramatic scene but instead stretches across seasons. Grayson continued his counseling, slowly rebuilding not a marriage, because Celeste had made clear through the careful, respectful conversations that followed that she was not interested in returning to what had broken her, but rebuilding himself, becoming a man capable of real friendship and real honesty for what felt like the first time since the war. He and Celeste eventually spoke, calmly and without the old resentments, and found a strange, hard-won peace in releasing each other from a marriage that had been built more on old dreams than present reality. There was grief in that ending, real grief, because even a love that outgrows itself deserves to be mourned properly rather than discarded carelessly, and Marcus made sure, in his own quiet way, that neither of them rushed through that morning. Nearly 2 years after that gray morning phone call, Marcus found himself once again sitting on porch steps with Celeste, though the porch was different now, smaller, attached to a modest house she had bought for herself 2 towns away, near her sister, in a life she had built entirely on her own terms. The tea between them was warm this time, and the silence that stretched between them was comfortable rather than heavy. She told him, that afternoon, that she had spent a long time being angry at fate for handing her a marriage that fell apart despite every reason it should have worked, a husband who came home alive and whole in body but absent in every other way, and a friendship with a good man that she had denied herself for fear of what it might cost everyone involved. But she said she had come to believe, slowly, that some things break not to punish us but to make room for something truer, and that she no longer wanted to spend her remaining years afraid of a happiness that had been sitting quietly beside her all along. Marcus, who had once died for a friend without a single moment's hesitation, who had been given the impossible gift of a second chance at life and used it to spare that same friend a bullet, found himself now facing a different kind of courage entirely, the courage to accept happiness he had once believed himself unworthy of, happiness that had cost his friend a marriage even though no one had ever intended such a cost, happiness that had been earned through years of patience, honesty, and hard, unglamorous growth rather than a single heroic act. He and Celeste did not rush into anything, did not seek to erase the complicated history that had brought them to that porch, but instead built something slow and deliberate and honest, checking in regularly with Grayson, who had become, against every reasonable expectation, one of Marcus's closest friends again, a man rebuilt from the wreckage of his own numbness into someone capable of showing up fully for the people in his life, including, eventually, a new woman he met through his counseling group, someone who understood exactly what kind of battles he had fought both overseas and within himself. If this story has touched something in you, I'd love for you to take a moment and leave a comment about what you believe true forgiveness looks like, or what you think it means to be given a second chance and to use it not for yourself but to try to spare someone else's pain, because I read every single comment and they mean more to me and to our community than you know. 3 years after that quiet, healing conversation on the porch, Marcus stood beside Grayson once more, this time not on a battlefield but at a small backyard wedding almost identical in its simplicity to the first one they had all attended together years before, paper lanterns swaying gently in the same warm afternoon light, except this time Marcus stood at the altar as the groom, and Grayson stood beside him as his best man, having insisted on the honor himself, saying that no one else on earth had earned the right to stand there more than the man who had carried him through the worst year of his life without ever once asking for anything in return. Celeste walked toward Marcus that afternoon in a simple white dress, her eyes finally free of the tiredness that had once lived in their corners, and Marcus, watching her approach, felt something settle in his chest that he could only describe as a debt finally, fully repaid, not a debt owed to Grayson, who had long since released him from any guilt, but a debt owed to whatever strange grace had given him a second chance at life in the first place, a chance he had spent not chasing his own survival but trying, however imperfectly, to spare the people he loved from unnecessary pain, only to discover that pain finds its own paths regardless, and that the truest heroism isn't in preventing every wound but in staying, patiently and honestly, to help someone heal from the wounds that come anyway. Grayson gave a short, unpolished toast at the small reception that followed, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been in years, and he said that he used to believe the greatest thing a friend could do for you was die in your place, but that he had come to understand, through the hardest lessons of his life, that the greatest thing a friend can do is stay alive and present through every ordinary, difficult day that follows, choosing honesty over easy comfort, choosing patience over resentment, choosing forgiveness over the bitterness that would have been so much easier to hold on to. He raised his glass to second chances, not just the dramatic kind that saves a life in an instant, but the quiet, daily kind that rebuilds one, and the small crowd gathered in that backyard, friends and family who had watched all 3 of them stumble and grow over the years, raised their own glasses in return, and for a moment, the ordinary afternoon light seemed to hold something almost sacred in it. Marcus never told anyone the full truth of what he remembered from a life he had technically never lived, the funeral no one attended, the folded flag, the slow decay of a marriage built on a foundation of guilt and grief. He carried that secret quietly, not as a burden but as a kind of private gratitude, a reminder that we are rarely given the chance to see the full cost of our choices before we make them, and that when we are given such a chance, however impossible or unexplainable, the only real answer is to choose kindness and honesty as best we can and trust that the rest will find its own way to healing. He had stopped taking a bullet for his comrade, and in doing so had watched, helplessly, as a different kind of wound opened in his friend's life anyway, a wound that no single sacrifice could have prevented, because life, it turns out, does not offer clean trades of one pain for another. What it offers instead, if we are patient and honest and willing to stay through the hard, unglamorous middle of things, is the slow, unglamorous, deeply human work of healing, forgiveness, and second chances that arrive not in a single dramatic instant but in 1,000 ordinary daytime moments strung together over years. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the part that moved you most, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder of hope and second chances today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one, because our community grows stronger every single time one of you chooses to be part of it, and there is nothing we value more than having you here with us. Years later, when people in that small town spoke of Marcus and Celeste and Grayson, they rarely spoke of the war, or the bullet, or the marriage that ended, because those things, however painful, had become simply the early chapters of a much longer story about what it means to survive not just danger but the slow, complicated aftermath of being alive, and to keep choosing, day after ordinary day, to love the people around you honestly rather than perfectly, to forgive rather than resent, to stay rather than run, and to believe, against every reasonable doubt, that even the most broken beginnings can be carried gently towards something whole.